mais par nos actes. Bâtissons un avenir où tous les êtres humains vivent et s'épanouissent dans la dignité. Je vous remercie.
I thank the Secretary General. Before proceeding further, and as indicated in my letters dated March 5th and 16th, 2026, I would like to consult members on inviting the following speakers to address the Assembly at this meeting. Ms. Esther Phillips, First Poet Laureate of Barbados, and Ms. Shadada Jack, First Youth Poet Laureate of Toronto, Canada. May I take it that it is the wish of the Assembly, and without setting a precedent, to invite these speakers to deliver statements at this meeting? It is so decided. I would like to propose that the list of speakers for this item to be closed in view of the large number of delegations inscribed on the list. Unless I hear any objection, I will take it that the Assembly agrees to close the list of speakers. It is so decided. I now have the honor to give the floor to Ms. Esther Phillips, First Poet Laureate of Barbados.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to imagine a young girl of about 11 years walking in these present times on the site of a sugar plantation and not understanding its historical significance. Meanwhile, her once enslaved ancestors, buried on that same plantation, are speaking among themselves as they observe her. In the following poem, my ancestors gifted me their silence. There are brief pauses. Listen as the ancestors are now speaking into those silences. Shh. Let her walk free, unhindered into the new world. She must not see the crimson of the dawn and think of. Let her see only purple flowers growing in the cut rock and not hear the back breaking. She must remember only the smell of ripe plums and guavas rising from the gully. Never the stink of. Let her gaze at the lacy leaves in the cluster of bamboo trees and not see that the branches were cut, stripped, and used for. The thick pole with holes cut into the crossbars was where the dark spot left on the ground by jamun berries was once the stain of. Shh. She's walking west of the great house, next to what she knows only as the yard. We were barely her age when Massa summoned us to his quarters. We were not the same when we came back. The children born to us were never ours to love as we wanted. Better they'd never seen the morning light. Better they'd been buried along with their navel strings under this same earth. But this girl, walking, she's one the old wise woman saw when we gathered late in the evenings, speaking over a pot of water so no one could hear us. It was then the old woman whispered her vision that One day, one day. Let the girl child think it's only birds, crickets, grasshoppers. The wind is slipping through the cuscus that she hears. Never the sounds of our Oh, my ancestors, so late for me to unwrap layer by layer this gift of your silence. But today I place my birth call over my eyes so I may see, and I weep for the bones I find here, the solitary cowrie shell, a broken comb, shreds of the Osnaburg that roughened your once smooth ebony skin, gave no ease to your torn flesh. I shed these tears from my oblivion, false buffer of empire that shrouded my hearing, veiled my sight, turned me, bastard child, away from my true mother. Now I unwrap the love you forced into silence, like a hedge to protect me, until the time would come for safer passage. What can I give you in return in these late years, this late awakening? The pledge of my voice, my words, the rest of this walking. My next poem attempts to express the feelings of an enslaved mother who knows that her child could be sold at any time. The name Odifo means survivor, although that survival may come sometime in the future. The title of the poem is Hard Love. She cannot stop her waters breaking, stanch the blood that comes with the birth of her son, or the flow of milk from her breasts. She holds him in her arms and feels the spirits of his fathers hover near. He is Odifo, Odifo, that is his name. She breathes the baby's name into his ear, into his spirit, so he may not forget. But even now she knows what cannot be. She must not fetter her son with tenderness. So as he grows, she flexes his feet and ankles to bear the weight of ball and chain, rubs her calloused hands down the soft skin of his back to ready him for whippings that will come. She lets the weight of her arms fall heavy on his neck as she hugs him. A yoke may be the collar he will wear. Some evenings she stands him near the cooking fire. She knows he must endure the searing of the branding iron deep into his flesh when he is marked, not with the name his fathers gave him, but as the property of the enslavers. These days in the fields the sun darkens. The white men have come like wild beasts on the hunt, and she knows, she knows. Just before daybreak one morning, Master sent for the boy, he must come. She whispers these final words to her son. You are Odifo, remember your name, Odifo. There's fear in his eyes, but also something deeper. My name is Odifo, he whispers back. 13 years old, and he's gone. He will not see how the bitter tasting vine she's used to bind her too full heart unravels, nor her red-rimmed eyes when all that she's held in breaks loose. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there remains a terrible breach, a gaping wound in the tapestry of humanity, indeed of the world. The name of that wound is the transatlantic slave trade, one of the worst atrocities inflicted by one group of human beings on another, and whose legacy remains to this day. The quest of Prime Minister Mia Mottley and others like myself is the reparation of that breach, perpetuated by racism and other forms of discrimination. According to legend, and there may be some truth in this, somewhere on the western shores of Africa, on the nights of the full moon, the elders light fires, hoping to light the way for the lost children of Africa to find their way back home. Members of the United Nations General Assembly, your very name implies commitment through your peace initiatives and humanitarian policies to igniting the fires of conscience, empathy, unity, and equity, so that home for all races and ethnicities is a place of belonging, of dignity, and no people are made to feel as if they are unwelcome strangers on this earth. There are spirits of the victims of slavery present in this room at this moment, and they are listening for one word only: justice. Because for them and for the world, there can be no peace without justice, reparatory justice. And that call is answered only when words are turned into action. Question is, what will you do? Thank you.
I thank you, Ms. Phillips, for your very strong and emotional words, and we should all not forget the name Odifo. I now give the floor to Ms. Shahada Jack, First Youth Poet Laureate of Toronto, Canada.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, Excellencies, friends, and guests, bonjour, and good morning. I would like to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to President Annalena Baerbock for the invitation and to everyone gathered here today in remembrance, reflection, and responsibility. We are here to honor the lives of those who were taken, those who endured, and those whose stories were never given the chance to be told. The transatlantic slave trade is not just history, it is a living legacy that continues to shape our world, our systems, and our understanding of justice and humanity. My name is Shahada Jack, and as Toronto, Canada's first Youth Poet Laureate, I stand here carrying both memory and possibility. Poetry is a way of reclaiming voice, of speaking back to silence, of honoring truth, and of imagining freedom beyond what was denied. And spoken word is considered the closest and most foundational art form to African ancestral storytelling. So today, the poem I am sharing is titled Reclaiming Our Pen. It is an offering, it is a remembering, and it is a call for all of us, especially the youth in this room, to continue telling our stories loudly, truthfully, and without permission. At an early age, my mother taught me that there are pages missing from world history, and they sound like our names, like the names of my grandmother and the women who came before me, women who were the descendants of African slaves, and somehow my blood already knew this to be true. The World Archives call this a trade, but my body remembers this as theft. My DNA remembers it as captivity and brutality. My DNA remembers its 2 million ancestors who died at sea. It remembers that before the ships and chains that we were whole, that our dignity was not something that we had to earn, but as something that we already carried. It remembers our liberty, not as a colonial gift, but as our innate birthright. See, my ancestors crossed oceans already free. Slavery was merely an interruption, not our origin story. For centuries, we existed as kings and queens before our being was deemed property. Now, museums profit off of our dynasties. Stolen heirlooms become historical artifacts. Our humanity now documented as mythology. See, history did not forget us or the spelling of our names. It simply stole the pen from our grip and edited us out, rewrote our realities and buried us in the margins. But they seemingly forgot that we were seeds. And no matter how many generations of oppressors tried to block the sunlight, our resilience relentlessly bloomed. We labored as resistance, used sacrifice as our weapon, and protested as promise. See, what the world calls survival, my ancestors called remembering who they were. Before displacement, there were nations that required no permission to choose who they love, or the garments that they wore, or the language that they spoke. Emancipation was not the merciful start to freedom, but the delayed recognition of a freedom that already existed. So on this day, remembrance becomes an act of reparation, a vow to tell the story, not as it was justified, but as it was lived. Our history is global history, and so is the responsibility to remember and document it truthfully, fully. So look inward and ask yourself, how do you hope to be remembered in this world's history books? What will be your legacy in the fight for justice and equality? The history of slavery remains as a plague on our society. Many of the injustices we fight today are symptoms of its atrocities, but it is not the burden of African descendants to carry. We will no longer be victims, and our dignity will no longer be questioned. We are not product, we are prodigy. Our resilience will be echoed in the remembrance of our ascendants' plight, our shared legacy. See, history will not be our destiny. Hope will continue to be inherited by lineages to come. Young minds will be empowered by the fight of their ancestral line. The youth will become the co-conspirators of a future written for all of us. We will be the ones pushing justice into action, etching into the fabric of time that our pain is our power, but our beauty is our story. Reclaiming our pen and writing our forgotten names back into the pages of history. Merci, thank you.
Ms. Jack, I thank you, and we're honored to hear your strong voice, not only for the youth, but also and especially for the youth. I would like to propose that the list of speakers for this item to be closed in the view of the large numbers of delegations, as we decided already before. Before proceeding further, and as indicated in my letters dated 5th and 16th of March, we have also zoomed to the speakers, and by this we are opening now our discussions on these proceedings. Before proceeding further, I wish to recall my letter on time management and speaking limits circulated to delegations on January 6, 2026. During this commemorative meeting, speakers are encouraged to adhere to the time limit of 5 minutes for statements made on behalf of a group of states and 3 minutes for delegations speaking in their national capacity. To assist delegations in managing their time, a countdown clock will be displayed on the screens, and I would really like to call and thank you for your cooperation. As the first speaker, I give the floor to His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, who will speak on behalf of the African states.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Your Excellency, Secretary General of the UN, Excellencies, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Progress is made in little steps. It is the forward motion towards something better, and changes often come incrementally. Today marks the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. It is a day on which we honor the memory of the approximately 13 million African men, women, and children who were enslaved over the course of several centuries. We remember them through articles, oral histories, through broadcast programs, books, music, visits to museums, monuments, and memorials such as the Ark of Return, located right here at the Visitors Plaza of the United Nations headquarters. Through these activities, we do more than remember. We document and educate, we gain greater perspective, we find the delicate balance of learning from history so that we do not repeat it while leaving our pain behind. In doing so, we begin to heal individually within our immediate communities and also within the global community. This day of remembrance did not happen by accident. In 2006, our global community gathered here, just as we have done today, and resolved to designate the 25th of March of the following year a day of remembrance. It marked significant progress. Then the following year, in 2007, we decided to make the event an annual one so that the 25th March of every year would be the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. That marked an additional step in our forward motion. And so it's indeed fortuitous to be here today, 2 decades later, addressing the General Assembly on behalf of the African Group regarding the draft resolution entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the Gravest Crime Against Humanity. In September last year, at the 80th session of the General Assembly, I stood in this exact place and served notice that Ghana will move a motion to declare the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. This current draft resolution is a result of months of consultation and consensus building by continental bodies, nations, experts, scholars, and jurists, with the sole aim of achieving a united front and grounding the final outcome in truth, compassion, and moral conscience, remembrance, education, and dialogue. So today we come together in solemn solidarity to affirm truth and pursue a route to healing and reparative justice. The adoption of this resolution serves as a safeguard against forgetting. It also challenges the enduring scars of slavery. Madam President, let me conclude with 2 significant quotes by 2 great leaders of history, one of them white and one of them black. The former President of the United States of America, Theodore Roosevelt, said, and I quote, "With a great moral issue involved, neutrality does not serve righteousness. For to be neutral between right and wrong is to serve wrong." Again, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King also reminds us, and I quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." We've traveled this long road, each step guided by a desire to be better and to do better, each step bringing us closer to the kind of world we would want to leave for our children. And so, delegates, on this beautiful day in March, we're called to stand on the right side of history. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right for the memory of the millions who suffered the indignity of the slave trade and those who continue to suffer racial discrimination. Let our vote on this resolution restore their dignity and humanity. I thank you for the opportunity.
I thank the President of the Republic of Ghana on behalf of the African states. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon, who will speak on behalf of the Asia-Pacific states.
Madam President, Excellencies, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group, as we mark today the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. As we commemorate this annual United Nations International Observance since 2007, we honor today the memory of the millions of women, men, and children who suffered, perished, and endured unimaginable hardship as a result of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Madam President, the transatlantic slave trade was not only a grave injustice that deprived countless individuals of their freedom, dignity, and humanity, but it also left enduring legacies of inequality, racism, and discrimination that continue to affect societies across the world. Remembering this history is essential, not only to pay tribute to the victims and the resilience of their descendants, but also to confront the lasting consequences of this tragedy with honesty and determination. This day reminds us of our shared responsibility to preserve the truth of history, to promote education and awareness, and to stand firmly against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in all their forms. Madam President, the fight against slavery is not only a legal or political obligation. It is a moral imperative. As we pay tribute to the memory of those who suffered from slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, let us reaffirm our collective commitment to justice, human dignity, equality, and the protection of human rights for all. Only through remembrance, reflection, and action can we ensure that such atrocities are never repeated, and that the future generations inherit a world grounded in respect, inclusion, and shared humanity. By working together with determination and solidarity, we can bring an end to this injustice and ensure a future where every individual lives in freedom and dignity. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, speaking on behalf of the Asia-Pacific states. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba, who will speak on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean states.
Señora Presidenta, Excelencias, distinguidos delegados y amigos, tengo el honor de pronunciar esta intervención en nombre del Grupo de Estados de América Latina y el Caribe, GRULAC. Expresamos nuestro más profundo agradecimiento a la Presidenta de la Asamblea General, la excelentísima señora Annalena Baerbock, por convocar esta sesión plenaria conmemorativa, así como al Secretario General, Su Excelencia António Guterres, por sus palabras. Hoy es un día no solo para recordar, sino también para reforzar el valor de proteger a la comunidad internacional de los errores del pasado. También quisiéramos agradecer a la señora Esther Phillips y a la señora Shahadat Jack por participar en esta sesión y por compartir sus valiosas reflexiones. Señora Presidenta, comenzamos rindiendo homenaje a todas aquellas mujeres, hombres, jóvenes y niños africanos que fueron separados de forma brutal y forzosa de sus seres queridos y sufrieron los errores de la esclavitud y la trata transatlántica de esclavos, uno de los capítulos más tristes de la historia de la humanidad. Hoy también rendimos homenaje a los pueblos indígenas que han sufrido y perdido la vida como consecuencia de la trata de esclavos. El legado del colonialismo en América Latina y el Caribe, que ha dado lugar a estructuras de racismo y discriminación profundamente arraigadas y persistentes, no debe olvidarse ni ignorarse. Al recordar el pasado, podemos contribuir a una mejor comprensión de este periodo de la historia y luchar contra sus legados, incluidos el racismo y los prejuicios. También debemos tomar medidas para desmantelar el racismo y la discriminación racial, incluido el racismo sistémico, que siguen teniendo un impacto negativo en las vidas de los afrodescendientes en todo el mundo. Señora Presidenta, reunidos hoy bajo el lema Justicia en Acción, afrontar la historia, promover la dignidad, empoderar el futuro, hacemos hincapié en la necesidad de pasar del recuerdo a la acción, de la simpatía al compromiso. La comunidad internacional debe adoptar medidas progresivas para alcanzar la Agenda 2030 para el desarrollo sostenible y aplicar la Declaración y el Programa de Acción de Durban, el cual reconoce que la esclavitud y la trata de esclavos son un crimen contra la humanidad y siempre deberían haberlo sido. El Grupo de Estados de América Latina y el Caribe señala que en 2026 conmemoraremos el 25 aniversario de la adopción de la Declaración y el Programa de Acción de Durban, uno de los instrumentos internacionales más importantes en la lucha contra el racismo y en la promoción de la igualdad racial. En este sentido, tomamos nota con aprecio a las negociaciones en curso de la Declaración sobre los Derechos Humanos de los Afrodescendientes como un hito en la conmemoración de este aniversario. El Grupo de Estados de América Latina y el Caribe se hace eco del llamamiento del Secretario General a favor de la justicia reparadora y al establecimiento de marcos de justicia reparadora para abordar esta terrible historia y sus legados. La justicia reparadora es esencial para reparar el presente y construir un futuro basado en la dignidad y la justicia. Se requiere una acción colectiva para impulsar el justo y firme llamamiento a las reparaciones. El grupo exhorta a los Estados miembros a que prosigan sus esfuerzos por integrar en los planes de estudio una comprensión integral del legado de la trata transatlántica de esclavos. Es esencial que sigamos educando al público, incluidos los niños y jóvenes, sobre la historia y el impacto de la trata de esclavos como medio para abordar su legado y promover la acción contra el racismo, la discriminación racial, el discurso de odio y los prejuicios, así como un medio para la reconciliación y la igualdad. Quienes no aprenden de la historia están condenados a repetir sus errores. Señora Presidenta, hoy en día es imprescindible reconocer el legado de la esclavitud y el hecho de que la esclavitud y las prácticas análogas a la esclavitud siguen persistiendo en forma de racismo estructural, desigualdades raciales, subdesarrollo, marginación y disparidades socioeconómicas que afectan a los africanos y a los afrodescendientes en todas partes del mundo. La comunidad internacional no puede quedarse de brazos cruzados ante tales desafíos. Debemos trabajar juntos para desmantelar las estructuras criminales transnacionales que perpetúan estas y otras formas de explotación y opresión. El legado de la esclavitud debe convertirse en un recuerdo lejano que nunca se repita. El grupo acoge con satisfacción la proclamación del segundo decenio internacional de los afrodescendientes 2025-2034, que contribuirá a intensificar nuestros esfuerzos por cumplir nuestros compromisos comunes en materia de reconocimiento, justicia y desarrollo para los afrodescendientes. El grupo reafirma su apoyo a las iniciativas, el mandato y la valiosa labor del Foro Permanente sobre los afrodescendientes. Poner fin al legado racista de la esclavitud es fundamental para construir un futuro de dignidad y justicia. Queda mucho por hacer para lograr la plena igualdad de todas las personas en nuestra región y en todo el mundo. Debemos seguir trabajando juntos para dar pasos progresivos hacia la lucha contra la discriminación racial, el racismo y el odio, al tiempo que movilizamos la voluntad política y los recursos. Sigamos trabajando por un mundo que no deje a nadie atrás. Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba, speaking on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean states. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, who will speak on behalf of the Western European and other states.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, I have the honour to speak on behalf of members of the Western European and other states group as we mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Today, we remember the millions of women, men and children who were brutally torn from their homes and pay tribute and respect to their descendants. Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade was abhorrent, an act spanning centuries and causing profound suffering. We welcome this year's theme, Justice in Action, Confronting History, Advancing Dignity, Empowering Futures, as an important lesson for us. We must never forget the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as its devastating consequences and long-lasting impacts. The role of education and the duty of remembrance is crucial in this respect. We must understand history to guide us to make the right choices in the future. And human rights are the cornerstone of that learning. A global commitment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the rights of equality and non-discrimination as a safeguard for future generations. We cannot change history, but we can and should talk about it. It is important that we engage in meaningful dialogue on sustainable development, on education, on health, on climate. To continue to make progress, we must confront the barriers and inequities that persist today. We remain committed to tackling these root causes by addressing racial discrimination, combating racism and xenophobia, and challenging all forms of intolerance wherever they appear. We recognise the establishment of a second international decade for people of African descent and the important work of the Permanent Forum in promoting and protecting human rights. We reaffirm our commitment to fully implement the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Colleagues, we must also address the scourge of modern slavery and related forms of exploitation, including trafficking, forced labour, sexual exploitation, and forced criminality, mainly of women and girls, but also boys and men. Modern slavery has increased and forms of exploitation continue to evolve, including trafficking for forced criminality into online scam operations. We welcome the political declaration agreed at the 4th high-level appraisal of the Global Plan of Action to combat trafficking in persons, which reaffirms commitments to tackle these challenges. We underscore our commitment to prevention efforts to reduce the vulnerability of those at risk of trafficking and exploitation, and to ensure that victims and survivors are provided with the support they need to begin rebuilding their lives. Madam President, while we cannot rewrite the past, we can choose how it guides us and strengthens our resolve to build a more just and inclusive future. Acknowledging the harm endured is a step toward healing and a commitment to ensuring such injustices are neither forgotten nor repeated. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom speaking on behalf of the Western European and other states. I would like to inform the Assembly, as I said before, that we have received requests from additional member states to speak in this commemorative meeting, yet the speaking list has been closed. As the next speaker, I give the floor to His Excellency Khalilur Rahman, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor for me to join this very important commemoration. At the outset, let me pay tribute to the millions of victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which remains a permanent scar on humanity, our common consciousness, and a stark reminder of moral degradation beyond comprehension. I also honor the extraordinary courage of those who stood against slavery and slave trade. My country, Bangladesh, stands firmly against apartheid, slavery, and genocide. Our Constitution rejects imperialism, colonialism, racism, and oppression. We firmly believe that no human being should ever again face the appalling tragedy of slave trade. Excellencies, this year we are observing the centenary of the 1926 Slavery Convention, and we are almost 80 years into the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that prohibited slavery and the slave trade. Yet, we must acknowledge that the ideologies of slavery did not end with its abolition. They still persist today in social hierarchies, economic structures, and political systems. We continue to witness modern-day slavery in many forms and manifestations. Madam President, acknowledging the historical truth about the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impacts is essential, but not enough. As we strive to realize the 2030 Agenda, we must renew our resolve to combat human trafficking. We must take coordinated actions on digital forensics, and we must invest in education and dialogue to build awareness of human and civilizational costs of slavery and slave trade. Madam President, on this solemn day, let us reaffirm our commitment to building a world where slavery and oppression will have no place. I thank you all.
I thank the distinguished representative and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Bangladesh. I now give the floor to the next speaker, Trinidad and Tobago, on behalf of the Caribbean community.
I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean community, CARICOM. We express and thank you as President, and also thank the high-level speakers for their contributions this morning, and further take this opportunity to recognize Ms. Esther Phillips, first Poet Laureate of Barbados, a daughter of our own region. We acknowledge the presence of His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, and we commend the Ghanaian delegation for the General Assembly initiative, which it has led on behalf of the African Union on the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans. Madam President, today we pay tribute to more than 15 million African men, women, and children who were forcibly captured and trafficked from their homeland across the Atlantic and into the Americas. On arrival in the Americas, they were subjugated to the brutal and horrific system of chattel enslavement by plantation owners and stripped of their dignity and rights for over 400 years. We continue to lament the immense losses engendered by this horrific crime against humanity, including the loss of intangible cultural heritage such as language and religion. We also pay tribute to the millions who died on the journey through the Middle Passage as a result of the unspeakable conditions to which they were subjected, and to those who chose death over a life of bondage. The Ark of the Return, the permanent memorial to honor the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade here at the United Nations headquarters, stands as a solemn reminder of those atrocities, their enduring legacies, and the responsibility we bear to confront them with honesty and resolve. CARICOM believes it is imperative to shed light on the past as a way of not only acknowledging history and truth, but also confronting it and understanding its continuing implications, though many decades have passed. We therefore remain strong advocates for comprehensive education and awareness to improve knowledge and understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. Madam President, we use this occasion to also pay homage to our forebears who resisted oppression and fought for their freedom and rights. Their victory over their colonial oppressors paved the way for the exercise of the right to self-determination and for us to develop our free societies and our people. Their uprisings, revolutions, and resistance movements changed the course of history, championing, in the face of oppression, their conviction that human rights and dignity belong not to a select few, but to all. The transatlantic slave trade constituted a crime against humanity and has left behind deep and persistent wounds in our societies. A significant number of citizens of CARICOM member states are people of African descent. Today, the legacies of this brutal era continue to manifest in our lives and societies, contributing to factors that drive high national debt, persistent poverty, psychological and generational trauma, health challenges, and certain social ills. Slavery and its transatlantic slave trade also ingrained in societies across the world the false doctrines and ideas of racial superiority, entrenching the scourge of racism and racial discrimination against Africans and people of African descent, which remains as one of the most egregious legacies of this period. This year, as we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, we do so in acknowledgement of the persistent challenges we face in eradicating racism and racial discrimination across the globe. Member states must work collectively to address this problem. If not meaningfully addressed, the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade will continue to hinder the progress of people of African descent across the world. We have a responsibility to ensure that people of African descent are not left behind. CARICOM calls for the repatriated justice is firmly grounded in the region's 10-point plan of reparatory justice, which elaborates a pathway to securing justice for victims of crimes against humanity, the atrocities and exploitation of colonialism, and the enduring legacies thereof. CARICOM also welcomes the convening of the 5th session of the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent to be held in Geneva in the coming month, and we encourage the active participation of member states. Madam President, as we reflect on this commemorative day, let us do so with a view to not only acknowledging the past, but to developing the necessary pathways to secure a better future for all, grounded in our resolve to create a more fair, equal, and just world for current and future generations. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago on behalf of the Caribbean community. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Armenia, Andorra, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Madam President, the transatlantic slave trade remains an unparalleled tragedy which lasted over 3 centuries and involved unspeakable atrocities affecting millions of Africans. 20 years ago, the General Assembly acknowledged the unprecedented scale and duration of the atrocities of slavery and the slave trade, condemning with the strongest words these human rights violations. The EU and its member states are actively engaged across all relevant fora to make progress on this issue, and we demonstrated our commitment through concrete domestic and international action. While the wrongs of the past cannot be undone, we must learn from them and strive to redress their enduring consequences in full adherence to international law by dismantling barriers and addressing the disparities that still prevent the full and equal participation of descendants in all aspects of society. We must continue to support efforts to shed light on the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as their causes, devastating consequences, and long-lasting impacts. We also acknowledge that more must be done to take into account the consequences of the transatlantic slave trade. This demands collective effort, rooted in a shared commitment to remembrance and the need to continue combating slavery in its contemporary forms. The EU and its member states remain open to every meaningful opportunity that fosters consensus and unity on this important matter. Still today, despite universal prohibition, slavery and slavery-like practices in the form of trafficking of persons for criminal or political purposes and other forms of modern slavery persist and constitute flagrant and daily violations of human rights. The EU is firmly committed to eradicating these abhorrent practices and actively works to eradicate slavery in all its forms through both legal frameworks and policies. The EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights enshrines the right to human dignity with the prohibition of slavery, forced labor, and trafficking in human beings. The EU regulation on prohibiting products made with forced labor reinforces this stance, enabling us to remove such goods from our single market, whether they are produced domestically or imported. Additionally, we actively support the International Labour Organization's fundamental conventions on forced labor, which are integrated into many of our trade instruments. In parallel, the European Union supports the international fight against racism and racial discrimination in all their forms, and is committed to the full implementation of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We will continue implementing global initiatives such as the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, which marks its 25th anniversary this year. And just last week, like every year, the EU convened an anti-racism conference that brought together policymakers, civil society, and independent equality bodies to exchange best practices. Madam President, the European Union and its member states reaffirm their commitment to eliminating all forms of modern slavery and building a just and equal society for all, where dignity and human rights are respected and protected. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso on behalf of the Confederation of States Sahel.
Excellences, Madame la Présidente de l'Assemblée générale, Excellences John Dramani Mahama, Président de la République du Ghana, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, Mesdames et Messieurs, j'ai l'honneur de délivrer cette déclaration au nom des pays membres de la Confédération des États du Sahel, à savoir le Mali, le Niger et le Burkina Faso. En prenant la parole en ce jour de commémoration de l'abolition de l'esclavage et du commerce transatlantique des esclaves, les pays membres de la Confédération voudraient s'incliner avec respect devant la mémoire de toutes les innocentes personnes qui ont subi injustement ces actes ignobles. Il est fort regrettable que des sociétés dites civilisées aient jugé normal à un moment de leur histoire de réduire systématiquement d'autres humains à l'état des choses, de les torturer, de les vendre, de leur enlever toute dignité, de leur nier leur humanité. La présente cérémonie ne doit pas se limiter au seul devoir d'honorer la mémoire des plus d'une dizaine de millions d'Africains déportés et réduits en esclavage dans des conditions inhumaines et dégradantes. Elle doit également être l'occasion de situer les responsabilités dans le tort causé à l'Afrique et à toute l'humanité, de marquer un engagement ferme et collectif à agir pour la justice, afin que de telles atrocités ne se répètent. Madame la Présidente, sur le sujet, certains États préfèrent le silence et étouffer la vérité de ces faits macabres. Au même moment, une batterie de mesures est déployée pour rappeler et commémorer d'autres tragédies humaines, parfois de moindre portée. La Confédération AES estime, bien au contraire, qu'il faut faire la lumière, il faut réparer. Le contexte actuel s'y prête, car certaines nations continuent de considérer l'Afrique comme leur chasse gardée, au point que leurs parlementaires, à l'image des esclavagistes d'hier, qui ont décidé du sort de millions d'Africains, s'arrogent le droit de légiférer sur la politique intérieure de la République sœur du Niger. La Confédération condamne cette posture pseudo-humaniste et néocolonialiste qui répond plus à une logique d'exploitation mercantiliste et impérialiste du continent. En effet, l'esclavage et la traite transatlantique d'hier et le terrorisme qui accourt aujourd'hui au Sahel n'ont-ils pas en commun, d'un côté, l'enrichissement des économies des puissances coloniales et impérialistes et de l'autre, l'appauvrissement et la désarticulation de l'Afrique? Si hier, ces puissances ont construit leur économie en vidant le continent africain de ses bras valides, aujourd'hui, ce sont les ressources naturelles de l'Afrique qui sont pillées en utilisant la stratégie de la terreur et des conflits sans fin via des mercenaires terroristes et autres groupes armés criminels financés et instrumentalisés. Madame la Présidente, face aux réflexes de ces États esclavagistes et impérialistes qui refusent de s'adapter à l'émancipation des peuples du Sahel et d'Afrique, la Confédération des États du Sahel demeure engagée pour soutenir toute initiative visant la restauration de la dignité des peuples noirs, y compris par le biais des réparations. C'est en cela que nous saluons et appuyons sans réserve l'initiative de l'Union africaine pour l'adoption d'une résolution visant à qualifier l'esclavage et le commerce transatlantique des esclaves des crimes les plus graves contre l'humanité. Nous remercions par la même occasion le Ghana pour avoir porté avec brio la voix du continent sur cette question cruciale et exprimons notre profonde gratitude à son Excellence John Dramani Mahama, président du Ghana. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso on behalf of the Confederation of States Sahel. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cyprus, followed by the Russian Federation and Equatorial Guinea.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. As we mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, Cyprus joins the international community in condemning these crimes against humanity and honouring the memory of the many millions of enslaved Africans who endured untold suffering and injustice during one of humanity's darkest chapters. For the millions of Africans who survived the abhorrent conditions of captivity before their journey and the horrific conditions of the Middle Passage, a life of degrading treatment, servitude, physical and sexual violence awaited. Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade continue to stand as one of the gravest atrocities in human history and a profound violation of human rights, stripping individuals of their freedom and of their humanity. For Cyprus, a country at the crossroads of continents and civilizations, remembrance carries a particular resonance. Our history, too, has been shaped by colonialism, division, displacement, and the denial of fundamental rights. While the transatlantic slave trade belongs to a different historical and geographical context, its legacy of dehumanization, inequality, and injustice is a reminder that respect for human dignity must never be taken for granted. This legacy can also be found in the entrenched systems of discrimination set up during slavery, but whose consequences undeniably persist to this day. Remembering this past is therefore not merely an act of tribute, it is a duty to acknowledge truth, to educate future generations, and to confront the enduring legacies of racism and exclusion wherever they arise. Madam President, on this day, we reaffirm our commitment to upholding the principles that bind us as an international community: respect for human dignity, equality, and justice. We must continue to fight against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and all forms of intolerance, and to promote inclusive societies. Remembrance must go hand in hand with action. By preserving historical memory and strengthening our collective resolve, we can ensure that the suffering endured by millions is neither forgotten nor repeated. Let us honor the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, not just with words, but with a renewed commitment to building a future where the rights and dignity of every person are fully protected and respected. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, ООН была учреждена более 80 лет назад с тем, чтобы положить конец легитимности теории расового превосходства и утвердить веру в достоинство и ценность человеческой личности, в развитие дружественных отношений между нациями на основе уважения принципа равноправия и самоопределения народов. Мы не должны забывать, что в страшную эпоху колониализма в ранг нормы была возведена нещадная эксплуатация выходцев из Африки, отношение к ним как к бездушным вещам. Примечательно, что именно колониальная политика и практики, выражавшиеся в работорговле, апартеиде, геноциде и других формах расизма, являлись истоком и питательной почвой для нацизма, запустившего самую страшную войну в истории человечества. Масштабы работорговли, в том числе трансатлантической, были настолько велики, что с трудом поддаются осмыслению и оценке. То же касается обременения, которое эпоха колониальных завоеваний наложила на развитие африканского континента. Именно в Африке произошли первые геноциды XX века. Тем не менее, поработители и по сей день не принесли извинения пострадавшим народам, не говоря уже о выплате им материальной компенсации за нанесение межпоколенческой травмы. Россия, сыгравшая ключевую роль в принятии в 1960 году в ООН Декларации о предоставлении независимости колониальным странам и народам и оказавшая всемирную помощь африканцам в национально-освободительной борьбе и становлении государственности и экономики, обеспечение обороноспособности и подготовки национальных кадров выражает восхищение тем, как африканские страны вырвались из оков колониализма. Мы придаем большое значение антиколониальной и репарационной повестке континента. Мы настроены на совместную работу с африканскими друзьями по данной проблематике, в том числе в рамках форума партнерства «Россия-Африка». Вопросы искоренения колониализма и неоколониализма находились и в центре обсуждений второй российско-африканской министерской конференции в Каире в декабре прошлого года. Госпожа председатель, единственной возможностью избежать повторения величайших трагедий прошлого остается сохранение в памяти поколений исторической правды. Именно поэтому усилия по борьбе с фальсификацией истории остаются одним из ключевых направлений российской внешней политики. В этой связи выражаем поддержку представляемому Ганой от имени африканской группы проекту резолюции Генеральной Ассамблеи объявления торговли порабощенными африканцами и расово обусловленного обращения африканцев в вечное рабство тягчайшим преступлением против человечности. Поддерживаем в этой связи и решение, прошедшее в феврале Ассамблеи Африканского Союза, направленные на объявление рабства, депортации и колонизации преступлениями против человечности и геноцидом народов Африки. Уважаемые коллеги, Международный день памяти жертв рабства и трансатлантической работорговли – это повод в очередной раз вспомнить о судьбах тех, чьей жизнью было оплачено благополучие и процветание колониальных держав. Однако наши общие усилия по достижению исторической справедливости не должны исчерпываться одним днем, они должны вестись на постоянной основе. Убеждены, что принимаемый сегодня документ станет рубежным этапом на этом пути и внесет весомый вклад в укрепление международно-правового режима борьбы с последствиями колониализма, расизмом и расовой дискриминацией. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Excelentísima señora Annalena Baerbock, presidenta de la 80ª sesión de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas. Señor Secretario General António Guterres, Excelencias, señoras y señores. Mi intervención va alineada a la hecha por Su Excelencia John Dramani Mahama, presidente de la República de Ghana, en nombre de África. Excelencia, señor presidente de la República, os deseo una respetuosa bienvenida y feliz estancia en Nueva York, a la vez que en nombre de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial os expreso nuestro reconocimiento por estar hoy aquí en la sesión de la Asamblea General, en la que se celebra este importante evento, como lo es la conmemoración del Día Internacional de las Víctimas de la Esclavitud y la Trata Transatlántica de Esclavos. Vuestra presencia física ilustra la gran importancia que el tema de este evento significa para África y patentiza los incansables y encomiables esfuerzos que está desplegando Su Excelencia para que la comunidad internacional y esta Asamblea General puedan reconocer y adoptar una declaración sobre la calificación de la trata de africanos esclavizados y la esclavitud racializada de africanos como crimen de lesa humanidad más grave. En efecto, señora presidenta, según estimaciones de la UNESCO, entre 15 y 20 millones de africanos fueron secuestrados y transportados en contra de su voluntad desde África hacia América del Norte, Central, Sudamérica y el Caribe durante 400 años. Muchísimos murieron durante su traslado a las Américas. Esta masiva deportación y la resultante esclavitud, como se describe en detalle en el proyecto de resolución, había sido considerada hasta ahora como una de las peores violaciones de los derechos humanos de toda la historia de la humanidad. Pero a partir de hoy, y tras la adopción del proyecto de resolución A/80/L48, será considerado como el más grave crimen contra la humanidad. Pues los efectos de este horrendo crimen se resienten todavía en las economías africanas y su legado racista sigue repercutiendo hasta hoy en día en los afrodescendientes en todo el mundo. Señora Presidenta, reconocer el pasado, reparar el presente, construir un futuro de dignidad y justicia, tema de esta conmemoración, debe ser objeto de una profunda reflexión y hacer un examen retrospectivo sobre el triste y vergonzoso trato que durante 4 siglos se infligió a los africanos. Las personas humanas que sucumbieron bajo el yugo de la esclavitud tenían poco refugio. Les quedaban sus creencias, sus tambores, su invencible voluntad de no morir. Corrían el peligro de perder su identidad y su razón de vivir. En este día de conmemoración de la trata de negros, del comercio transatlántico de esclavos, la República de Guinea Ecuatorial rinde el más vibrante homenaje al coraje de los cerca de 5 millones de hombres y mujeres negros que cayeron bajo el yugo esclavista y celebramos su temeridad. Saludamos a Toussaint Louverture, saludamos a Aimé Césaire, saludamos a los negros marrones, saludamos a los valientes combatientes de Jamaica, a aquellos de Haití, de Perú, a aquellos de toda la diáspora africana que se enfrentaron a la ignominia. Señora Presidenta, permítame saludar aquí una vez más a todos los que contribuyen en la lucha a través de su creatividad. Saludamos así al arquitecto Ronnie León, quien diseñó y construyó el Arca de Retorno, un memorial permanente en honor a las víctimas de esclavitud y comercio transatlántico de esclavos, que se encuentra ubicado en la explanada de esta sede de las Naciones Unidas y para cuya construcción Su Excelencia el Presidente de la República de Guinea Ecuatorial, Obiangama Mbazo, hizo una importante contribución. Concluyo esta intervención, señora Presidenta, señalando que todos formamos parte de una misma familia, una gran familia y que es la familia de la humanidad. En esta gran familia no debe caber ni deben darse los tratos vejatorios y discriminativos contra unos miembros de esta. En este año, en el que se le celebra el centenario de la abolición de la esclavitud por la Liga de las Naciones en 1926, todos juntos, señora Presidenta, del Caribe, de África y de todas partes del mundo, digamos juntos en alta voz, gritemos juntos muy alto y cantemos juntos nunca más, y que cesen las discriminaciones raciales y las supremacías. Todos somos de la gran familia de la humanidad. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Equatorial Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, Excellencies, Vietnam aligns itself with the statement delivered by Lebanon on behalf of the Asia-Pacific Group and wishes to make the following remarks in its national capacity. Today, we honor the memory of the millions of victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. This history is marked not only by immense suffering and injustice, but also by enduring consequences that continue to resonate in various forms across societies today. We stand in solidarity with Africans and people of African descent who continue to bear the lasting impacts of this tragic legacy. In Vietnam, earlier chapters of our own history were also marked by profound suffering, loss, and the denial of fundamental rights under brutal colonialism. While each nation's experience is unique, many of us share a common understanding of the importance of preserving historical memory and upholding human dignity. As former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan once reminded us, I quote, "We may have different religions, different languages, different colored skin, but we all belong to one human race." End of quote. This simple yet powerful truth calls upon us to act with empathy, solidarity, and a shared sense of responsibility. To truly honor the past, we must confront it with honesty, humility, learn from it, and translate remembrance into meaningful action. Justice is not only about reckoning with history, it is about the choices we make today. To that end, we must uphold international human rights framework, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We must also invest in education, promote dialogue and cooperation, and address the lasting consequences of slavery and the slave trade, including through resolute efforts to combat racism and discrimination in all its forms. Honoring the past must guide us towards a more just and inclusive future for all, where dignity is protected, equality is realized, and such tragedies are never repeated. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente. La República Bolivariana de Venezuela valora las intervenciones de quienes participaron en el segmento de apertura de este evento. Saludamos igualmente la participación del excelentísimo señor John Dramani Mahama, presidente de la República de Ghana. Permítanos también rendir tributo a la memoria de todas las víctimas de la esclavitud y de la trata transatlántica de esclavos, incluyendo a sus descendientes. En esta fecha resulta esencial reconocer el sufrimiento de millones de personas que fueron arrancadas de sus tierras y familias y sometidas a condiciones inhumanas. También es vital reconocer en este contexto la resistencia, la dignidad y la lucha de quienes, en medio de la barbarie, defendieron su humanidad y legaron un ejemplo de fortaleza y resiliencia. La conmemoración de este Día Internacional nos recuerda además que el racismo, la discriminación racial, la xenofobia y las formas conexas de intolerancia no son vestigios del pasado y no han sido completamente superados. Señor presidente, para nuestro país, recordar este crimen histórico no constituye un ejercicio de memoria, pues, ante todo, es un deber moral y político. A nivel nacional, Venezuela ha promovido iniciativas como el establecimiento de una comisión presidencial para el esclarecimiento de la verdad histórica, la justicia y la reparación sobre el dominio colonial y sus consecuencias. En el contexto de las Naciones Unidas, impulsamos desde el Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas la adopción de la Resolución 80/116, a través de la cual se estableció el 14 de diciembre como el Día Internacional contra el Colonialismo en todas sus formas y manifestaciones. Nos valemos de esta ocasión para reconocer el liderazgo de la Unión Africana y de la República de Ghana al frente de la propuesta de resolución sobre la declaración de la trata transatlántica y la esclavitud racializada de africanos como uno de los más graves crímenes contra la humanidad, que será considerada próximamente por esta Asamblea General. Nuestro país ha apoyado este proyecto de resolución desde el inicio e invita a todas las delegaciones a respaldar esta iniciativa a través de su voto favorable. Concluimos, pues, enfatizando que no solo habrá verdadera justicia cuando la memoria vaya acompañada de verdad, reparación, dignificación de los pueblos afectados y una firme voluntad de erradicar todas las formas contemporáneas de colonialismo, racismo y exclusión. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, je cite « Reconnaissance. La traite et l'esclavage, perpétrés à partir du XVe siècle aux Amériques, aux Caraïbes, dans l'océan Indien et en Europe, contre les populations africaines, amérindiennes, malgaches et indiennes, constituent un crime contre l'humanité. C'est dans ces termes que, première au monde, la France reconnut ce crime il y a 25 ans par une loi qui porte le nom de son auteur, Madame Christiane Taubira, et qui puise dans les idéaux au fondement des Nations Unies. L'abomination de l'esclavage a frappé des siècles durant des millions de femmes, d'hommes et d'enfants bafouant les droits de l'homme, niant le principe même de dignité de la vie humaine. Nous commémorons ensemble la mémoire des victimes de ce système barbare, de ceux qui l'ont combattu, de ceux qui ont œuvré à son abolition. Et dans la sinistre litanie des crimes que l'humanité s'inflige à elle-même, Shoah, apartheid, épurations ethniques, oui, la traite et l'esclavage doivent être reconnus pour ce qu'ils furent, une abomination. Mémoire. La reconnaissance de la vérité et le devoir de mémoire auquel nous invite le président de la République du Ghana nous offrent, à nous, États membres des Nations Unies, la chance de bâtir un avenir en commun. Afin que vive la mémoire de l'esclavage et de la traite, nous devons soutenir le travail des historiens, ouvrir les espaces de dialogue, renforcer nos coopérations, lutter sans relâche contre le négationnisme et les fausses vérités qui se propagent sur les réseaux sociaux, nouveau cancer de notre temps. La France y est pleinement engagée, en particulier au cœur de ses collectivités ultramarines, auprès des diasporas africaines, de nos partenaires africains. Après avoir créé en 2019 une fondation pour la mémoire de l'esclavage, nous inaugurerons à Paris le mémorial national des victimes de l'esclavage, là même où fut adoptée la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Nous instituons des commissions binationales d'historiens chargées d'examiner notre passé commun, comme avec Haïti. Nous soutenons les travaux mémoriels des Nations Unies, tels le réseau des lieux d'histoire et de mémoire porté par l'UNESCO. Action. La mémoire des victimes nous commande de redoubler d'efforts dans la lutte contre le racisme et contre les formes modernes d'esclavage, combats universels d'aujourd'hui ancrés dans le droit international. Appliquons mieux la Convention internationale sur l'élimination de toutes les formes de discrimination raciale et poursuivons ce combat jusque dans l'environnement numérique où prospèrent les discours de haine. Alors que sévissent le travail forcé, l'esclavage domestique, l'exploitation sexuelle, le trafic de migrants, veillons au respect des conventions dédiées de l'OIT ainsi que de la Convention des Nations Unies contre la criminalité organisée. Au-delà, renforçons les instruments juridiques pour prévenir et réprimer les crimes contre l'humanité. La France soutient l'élaboration d'une convention internationale dédiée dont l'adoption constituerait une avancée majeure de la justice pénale internationale. Monsieur le Président, le devoir de civilisation nous impose de lutter sans relâche contre les instincts de violence et de destruction qui habitent l'humanité. Se souvenir activement des horreurs de l'esclavage et de la traite, ce n'est pas seulement honorer la mémoire des victimes, c'est aussi protéger le monde et l'humanité. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this important meeting. My delegation aligns itself with a statement delivered by Ghana on behalf of the Africa Group. Ethiopia joins the international community in solemn remembrance of millions of African men, women, and children who were subjected to the horrors of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. This day stands as a reminder of the gravest crime against humanity and historical injustices. The tragedy of slavery stripped generations of their humanity. The transatlantic slave trade and colonialism represent two of history's most extensive crimes against humanity, leaving legacies that continue to adversely influence Africa's contemporary socio-economic landscape and development trajectory. Slavery, apart from its cruel extractive nature, it disrupted social systems and fundamentally reconfigured economies, governance structures, and cultural institutions across Africa and beyond. As we reflect on this painful chapter, we underscore the importance of education, truth-telling, and the preservation of historical memory. We are of the view that acknowledging this gravest crime against humanity is crucial for honoring the victims and also for compensating with reparation for the atrocities committed. Addressing the structural and historical roots of inequality, including the socio-economic consequences that continue to affect people of Africa and African descent particularly, is important. Commemoration, therefore, must go beyond retrospective remembrance. It must serve as a call to confront the living consequences with courage. In the same vein, Ethiopia commends the leadership of Ghana on behalf of the Africa Group for successfully tabling the draft resolution declaration of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. In conclusion, we pay tribute to the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and also to those courageous abolitionists who fought to stop such atrocities. We hope this day would serve as a first step to renew our collective determination to rectifying the damage and build a world founded on the inherent dignity of all humanity. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ethiopia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guinea.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, la délégation s'aligne sur la déclaration faite au nom du groupe africain et adresse ses chaleureuses félicitations à son Excellence M. John Dramani Mahama, Président de la République du Ghana, champion de l'Union africaine pour la justice et les réparations pour les Africains, pour son leadership et son engagement en faveur de cette importante cause, tristement portée en héritage par près de 2 milliards d'habitants de notre planète. L'esclavage et la traite transatlantique rappellent le chapitre le plus sombre et tragique de notre histoire commune et leurs conséquences dévastatrices qui se sont étendues sur plusieurs continents continuent à ce jour d'affecter profondément nos sociétés. Pendant 4 siècles, entre 12 et 20 millions d'Africains ont vu leur vie décimée à travers un système odieux qui a ancré la capture, le transport forcé et l'asservissement racialisé au cœur de l'action des États. De toute l'histoire de notre humanité, aucun crime n'a cumulé à la fois un nombre de victimes, une durée, une marchandisation, une déshumanisation d'une ampleur telle que l'esclavage et la traite transatlantique. Aucun crime n'a non plus produit les conséquences aussi durables, notamment la destruction à grande échelle des sociétés africaines et l'enracinement d'inégalités racialisées qui continuent, fort malheureusement, de structurer encore de nombreux modes de pensée, y compris dans les relations internationales. Il est impérieux de rejeter énergiquement ces modes de pensée dégradants et rétrogrades et de redoubler d'efforts pour lutter contre toutes les formes d'assujettissement, de racisme, d'inégalité systémique et d'injustice structurelle. Monsieur le Président, en cette journée de commémoration, nous avons l'obligation de réaffirmer notre engagement collectif à intensifier nos efforts de reconnaissance de la vérité historique et d'entreprendre des mesures de réparation de ces crimes. Il ne s'agit pas de rouvrir des divisions historiques, mais plutôt de reconnaître la réalité et l'ampleur de cette tragédie, car l'administration véritable de la justice commence par la reconnaissance des faits. Les mesures de réparation et de justice doivent en cela s'élargir à l'éducation et à la sensibilisation, notamment sur les systèmes de gouvernance avant-gardistes et protecteurs des droits de l'homme qui existaient dans les sociétés africaines et qui ont été délibérément ébranlés et détruits par les régimes esclavagistes. À ce titre, la charte de Kouroukanfouga, ou charte du Manding, proclamée en 1236, posait déjà les grands principes de l'organisation sociale et consacrait les droits de l'homme, notamment celui à la vie et à la préservation de l'intégrité physique de chacun et la participation des femmes aux instances de décision. Pour terminer, ma délégation, au nom de son Excellence, Monsieur le Président de la République de Guinée, réitère ses vives félicitations à la République du Ghana pour ses efforts qui ont permis de soumettre à notre Assemblée un projet de résolution sur la traite et l'esclavage racialisé des Africains et nous exhortons l'ensemble des délégations à y souscrire car il s'agit de réaffirmer notre attachement à la liberté, à la justice, à l'égalité et au respect de la dignité humaine. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Señora Presidenta, Colombia le agradece por convocar esta sesión plenaria conmemorativa con motivo del Día Internacional en recuerdo de las víctimas de la esclavitud y la trata transatlántica de personas esclavizadas. Este espacio de reflexión adquiere especial relevancia en un contexto global donde resurgen narrativas que buscan negar el pasado, relativizar sus efectos y deshumanizar en razón de raza, género, orientación sexual, nacionalidad o religión. Permítame recordar la reflexión del presidente Gustavo Petro. Existe una sola humanidad y la posibilidad de superar los principales problemas actuales, crisis climática y pobreza, comienza por un diálogo entre civilizaciones que se saben diferentes. Para millones de seres humanos, la esclavización, la trata transatlántica y el colonialismo definió destinos, reconfiguró continentes y dejó cicatrices que todavía condicionan posibilidades de vida. En Colombia, estas memorias no son ajenas, forman parte de nuestra identidad, de nuestras luchas y de nuestros compromisos. En efecto, confrontar la historia implica examinar el pasado sin evasiones, para identificar las estructuras discriminatorias que aún subsisten y trabajar colectivamente para desmantelarlas. En este sentido, Colombia acoge la declaración propuesta por Ghana y ha decidido apoyarla como expresión de su compromiso con la justicia histórica y con la reivindicación plena de los derechos de las personas afrodescendientes. Para avanzar con dignidad, debemos reconocer las formas de exclusión que afectan de manera diferenciada a pueblos indígenas y afrodescendientes, migrantes, mujeres y otras poblaciones históricamente marginalizadas. Reconocer estas realidades es un paso esencial para avanzar hacia políticas públicas y marcos internacionales que promuevan dignidad, igualdad sustantiva y justicia para todas las personas. Igualmente, empoderar los futuros requiere fortalecer mecanismos multilaterales y de cooperación para cerrar brechas, así como repensar la manera en que nos relacionamos como regiones y como pueblos. Desde esta visión, Colombia convocó el foro de alto nivel CELAC África que se celebró en Bogotá, donde iniciamos una conversación birregional sobre cómo rediseñar nuevas formas de cooperación, comercio, movilidad y conocimientos. Ese encuentro demostró que a pesar de las diferencias somos una sola humanidad y nuestras regiones pueden construir soluciones conjuntas en materia de desarrollo sostenible, justicia histórica, equidad digital, salud, transición energética y fortalecimiento institucional. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Haiti.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames, Messieurs les ambassadeurs, la République d'Haïti salue la tenue de cette séance commémorative de l'abolition de l'esclavage et de la traite transatlantique des esclaves. Pour Haïti, cette date est plus qu'un symbole, mais c'est un devoir de mémoire, une exigence morale et une responsabilité collective. Haïti souscrit à la déclaration faite par le président de la République du Ghana, ainsi qu'aux déclarations faites par le Goulag et la CARICOM. Monsieur le Président, il y a des silences qui traversent les siècles, des silences lourds, de chaînes, de souffrances, de vies brisées. Aujourd'hui, Haïti ne voudrait pas parler seulement pour elle-même. Elle voudrait parler au nom de toutes celles et de tous ceux que l'histoire a trop longtemps réduits au silence. Des femmes, des hommes, des enfants arrachés à leur terre, dépouillés de leur nom, de leur dignité, de leur humanité. Nous parlons aujourd'hui pour qu'ils ne soient jamais oubliés. La traite transatlantique des esclaves ne fut pas seulement une tragédie, elle fut une entreprise organisée de déshumanisation. Pendant plus de 4 siècles, des millions d'Africains ont été assimilés à des marchandises, des corps enchaînés, des vies comptabilisées, des existences niées. Et pourtant, même dans l'ombre la plus profonde, la dignité humaine n'a jamais disparu. Haïti en est la preuve vivante. Il y a plus de 222 ans, des femmes et des hommes que l'on disait sans voix, sans droit, sans avenir, ont défié l'ordre du monde. Ils n'ont pas seulement brisé leur chaîne, ils ont brisé une idée, celle selon laquelle certains êtres humains seraient nés pour dominer et d'autres pour être dominés. Ils ont affirmé au prix de leur sang une vérité simple et universelle: la dignité humaine n'a pas de douleur, n'a pas de couleur. Haïti le dit aujourd'hui avec clarté, la lutte contre le racisme ne peut être productive que si elle s'accompagne de justice, justice dans les discours, justice dans les politiques. Chaque fois qu'un enfant traverse une frontière dans la peur, chaque fois qu'une vie est jugée moins digne d'une autre, chaque fois que l'histoire est oubliée, c'est une part de cette tragédie qui continue. On rougit de rappeler des vérités aussi simples, mais comme dirait Jean-Paul Sartre, il semble qu'on les ait oubliées. Haïti est né d'un refus, le refus de l'esclavage, le refus du racisme, le refus de la négation de l'humanité. Aujourd'hui, elle se tient devant vous avec une conviction intacte. Le monde que ces femmes et ces hommes ont imaginé en 1804, un monde d'égalité et de dignité, reste à accomplir. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Haiti. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Namibia.
Mr. President, my delegation welcomes the convening of this commemorative meeting of the General Assembly to mark the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and transatlantic slave trade. Namibia aligns itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana and African Union champion on advancing the cause of justice and the payment of reparations to Africans on behalf of the African states. My delegation wishes to recognize with appreciation the participation of Ms. Esther Phillips, First Poet Laureate of Barbados, and Ms. Shahada Jek, First Youth Poet Laureate of Toronto, Canada, in this commemorative meeting. Your insightful and moving words added a significant value to our discussion, and we are grateful for your contributions. Mr. President, my delegation commends Ghana for your courage and leadership in advancing our shared commitment to addressing historical injustices committed against Africans and the people of African descent through transatlantic enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid, as well as the inequities that persist in the international economic and political orders. We recall that the atrocities of slavery, the slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, racial segregation, subjugation, and the exploitation of resources denied and violated the humanity and dignity of Africans and people of African descent. Their legacies are not confined to the past, as their social, economic, and cultural consequences continue to be experienced to this day. This year's commemoration is particularly significant due to the introduction of the resolution declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as a gravest crime against humanity. This resolution offers the international community a collective moment of reflection on enduring legacies of slavery and affirms the African Union's commitment to reparatory justice, historical accountability, and healing of Africans and for the people of African descent. Excellencies, although the international community formally committed itself over a century ago to end slave trade, including through decolonization efforts and the codification of human rights, justice remains incomplete. In particular, gaps persist in legal accountability for colonial wrongs and in addressing the transgenerational social, economic, and cultural harm inflicted on our peoples, communities, and countries. This resolution, therefore, represents an important multilateral step in advancing truth, remembrance, learning, and collective moral responsibility, while keeping open pathways for continued dialogue on reparatory justice. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Namibia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Nigeria aligns itself with the statement delivered by His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, on behalf of the African Group and for his leadership in the discourse on this important issue, and in our national capacity underscore the historic importance of this event. We join the global community in the spirit of profound solemnity to honor the memory of the millions of African men, women, children who were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. This was not merely a dark chapter in history, It was a 400-year crime against humanity that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the African continent and the modern world. For Nigeria, this remembrance is personal. The shores from which our ancestors were taken are not merely geographical or geographic markers, they are sacred sites of memory, resilience, and unfinished justice. Confronting history requires history. The transatlantic slave trade was a systemic engine of exploitation to foil the industrial and economic rise of distant shores. Nigeria therefore maintains that true justice begins with a global curriculum that accurately reflects this history, ensuring that the roots of systemic racism and prejudices are identified and dismantled at their sources. Mr. President, advancing dignity is at the heart of our collective responsibility. As we navigate the international decade for people of African descent, we must recognize that the broken bones of slavery have manifested in modern society in systemic marginalization and racial profiling. Therefore, combating modern slavery is essential by eradicating contemporary forms of servitude, including human trafficking, which continue to stain our global conscience. Nigeria stands in solidarity with the people of African descent and calls on all member states to support the resolution to be tabled today. Supporting and voting in favor of this resolution is a roll call of conscience reflecting where member states stand in confronting racism and advancing the reconciliation of historical injustices. Mr. President, in conclusion, we should not let this day end in reflection alone, but it should mark a renewed resolve, a collective commitment to transform memory into action, injustice into equity, and pain into purpose. In doing so, we affirm not only the dignity of those who were lost, but the promise of those who carry their legacy forward. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria. I now give the floor to the observer of the observer state of the Holy See.
President, on this International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, the Holy See delegation joins others in honoring the memory of the millions of people who were victims of enslavement. The Holy See unequivocally condemns slavery, including in its modern forms. The call for remembrance today is a reminder to all states of their duty to uphold historical truth and ensure legal accountability. As Pope Leo stated, since apostolic times, the Church has seen the liberation of the oppressed as a sign of the kingdom of God. This mission of liberation has continued throughout the centuries through concrete actions, especially when the tragedy of slavery and imprisonment has marked entire societies. These convictions have been expressed in numerous papal documents. For example, as early as 1435, Pope Eugene IV condemned the enslavement of the inhabitants of the Canary Islands and excommunicated those who refused to free them. Subsequently, in 1888, Pope Leo XIII condemned slavery as contrary to the Christian values, recalling that God, having created man a reasonable being and after his own likeness, he wished that he should rule only over the brute creation and not be the master of man. Mr. President, the draft declaration under consideration contains a partial narrative which regrettably does not serve the cause of truth. Historical memory, when based on accurate and impartial historical information, together with education and awareness raising, plays a fundamental role in preventing the recurrence of such grave scourges of humanity. At the same time, it is important to reaffirm that under international law, modern slavery constitutes a crime against humanity when committed as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. Therefore, the Holy See reaffirms that no one should be held in slavery or servitude as set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Mr. President, allow me to conclude with the words of Pope Leo, who reminded us that the freedom that Christ gave us is not only interior, it manifests itself in history as love that cares for and frees us from every bond of slavery. Thank you.
I thank the observer of the Observer State of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Authority on Development.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies and distinguished delegates, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Workana Gabayo, the Executive Secretary of IGAD. And I would like to confirm that my delegation aligns with the statement made by the Republic of Ghana on behalf of African states. We gather today in remembrance of a history that reshaped humanity. The transatlantic slave trade scattered families, separated generations, and disrupted the very foundation of human society. Millions were taken, communities were broken, human dignity was denied on a scale that continues to defy global realities. Its consequences did not end. They remain present. Across generations, many still live with the weight of that history through inequality, through limited opportunities, and through systems that continue to reflect those imbalances. Mr. President, although we cannot change the past, we carry full responsibility for how its consequences are addressed. That responsibility is not symbolic. It is practical, and it is immediate. Today, nearly 50 million people are living in conditions of modern-day slavery. Throughout labor, human trafficking, and exploitation that continues in different forms. This reality calls for a clarity of purpose. Human dignity must be protected, consistent and without exception. Excellencies, Africa's history reflects both of suffering and strength. From the shores where millions were taken, to moments like Adwa, where dignity was defended with determination, our one principle remains constant. Dignity endures, and it demands recognition. Mr. President, the theme before us, justice in action, confronting history, advancing dignity, empowering future, calls for a steady and deliberated progress. It calls for implementation. It calls for partnership. It calls for accountability. As the Executive Secretary of IGAD has emphasized, justice gains meaning when action reflects memory. Excellencies, the United Nations provides the framework, member states provide the leadership, and together, progress becomes possible. Sustained implementation of commitment is essential, continued cooperation is necessary, and shared responsibility must remain at the center of our effort. Mr. President, this day is a day of what humanity has endured. It is also a reminder of what humanity can correct. Through consistent effort, through principled action, and through collective resolve, we can continue to advance dignity and inclusion. Let this be a moment that strengthens that direction, and I thank you.
I thank the observer of the International Authority on Development. We have had the last speaker in this commemorative meeting. The Assembly has thus concluded its commemorative meeting to mark the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and Transatlantic Slave Trade. Action on the draft resolution submitted under this item will take place after the collection of the ballots for the appointment of members of the board of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 119. The Assembly will consider sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115 entitled Appointment of Members of the Board of the 10-year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production Patterns. Members will recall that the Assembly, by its Resolution 67/203 of 21 December 2012, decided to establish the 10-member board consisting of 2 members from each United Nations General Group, Regional Group. In its Decision 67/564 of 16 September 2013, the Assembly decided that regional groups shall be authorized to nominate new members of the board. Furthermore, by its Resolution 69/214 of 19 December 2014, the Assembly decided that the duration of subsequent terms for members of the board shall continue to be 2 years, starting on 16 September of every second year, and that the United Nations regional groups may nominate one of their existing 2 members of the board for 1 consecutive term, while ensuring that no member state is eligible to serve more than 2 consecutive terms and taking into account the importance of ensuring continuity and rotation in the work of the board. Members will also recall that in its Decision 78/418A of 13 August 2024, the Assembly decided that the 2-year term of the members of the board shall begin on 21 March 2024, the date of their appointment, taking into account Resolution 69/214 of 19 December 2014. The Assembly subsequently appointed members of the board for terms ending on 20 March 2026. Consequently, the Assembly needs to appoint 10 members of the board for a new term of office. Bearing in mind the provisions of Resolution 69/214 as outlined above, I propose that the new 2-year term of the members of the board shall begin on the date of their appointment. That is today, 25 March 2026. May I take it that the Assembly wishes to proceed accordingly? It is so decided. In view of the request made at the 73rd plenary meeting held on 10 March 2026, the Assembly will now proceed to this appointment by secret ballot. With regard to the candidatures, I should like to inform members of the following nominations by regional groups. For the 2 seats from among the African states, only 1 endorsed state has been communicated, namely the Republic of South Africa. For the 2 seats from among the Asia-Pacific states, only 1 state has been communicated, namely India. For the 2 seats from among the Eastern European states, two 2 states have been communicated, namely Hungary and the Russian Federation. For the 2 seats from among the Latin American and Caribbean states, the following 2 endorsed states have been communicated, namely Barbados and Mexico. For the 2 seats from among the Western European and other states, the following 2 endorsed states have been communicated, namely Finland and Germany. Before we begin the voting process, I should like to remind members that, pursuant to Rule 88 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, no representative shall interrupt the voting except on a point of order on the actual conduct of the voting. Any announcements, including those concerning withdrawals of candidatures, should therefore be made prior to the commencement of the voting process. That is to say, before the announcement of the beginning of the voting process. In addition, ballot papers will only be given to the delegates seated directly behind the country's nameplate. We shall now begin the voting process. Ballot papers marked A, B, C, D, and E will now be distributed, and the voting has thus begun. In accordance with Resolution 71/323 of 8 September 2017, the names of the states that have been communicated to the Secretariat at least 48 hours prior to the election today have been printed on the ballot papers for each of the regional groups. Only those candidates nominated by the regional groups are eligible for this appointment and are indicated on the ballot paper. I request representatives to use only those ballot papers that have been distributed and to put an X in the ballot boxes next to the names of states whom they wish to vote for. There shall be no write-ins. A blank ballot paper will be considered an abstention. If a ballot paper contains any notation other than votes in favor of eligible member states, those notations will be disregarded. I invite the representatives of the following states to serve as tellers and to accompany the conference officers as they collect the ballot papers: Brunei Darussalam, Ecuador, Italy, Lesotho, Montenegro, and Sweden. I invite the representatives of the flowing states to serve as tellers and to accompany the conference officers as they collect the ballot papers. Brunei Darussalam, Ecuador, Italy, Lesotho, Montenegro, and Sweden. Please proceed to collect the ballot papers. May I request delegations who have not voted to do so now by approaching the podium to cast their votes. The voting is now closed. No more ballot papers will be accepted. In the interest of time, the Assembly will now proceed to consider the other items announced in the United Nations Journal while the ballots are being counted. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 119 entitled Commemoration of the Abolition of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade to take action on a proposal announced in the journal. I give the floor to His Excellency Samuel Okudzeto Ablakwa, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana, on behalf of the African Group, to introduce Draft Resolution A/80/L.48.
The President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates, today we gather in solemn reflection on the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, a day when humanity pauses to remember millions of women, men, and children whose lives were stolen, whose dignity was denied, and whose humanity was questioned, yet whose resilience reshaped the moral arc of our shared history. This day is not merely an act of remembrance. It is a call to conscience. It reminds us that memory without action risks becoming silent, and silence has never been the ally of justice. Your Excellencies, in September 2025, during the general debate of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the President of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, announced that Ghana will introduce a draft resolution entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. 6 months to this very day, I have the distinct honor to present this resolution to the General Assembly on behalf of the African Group. This resolution does not create legal hierarchies of crime, as some have wrongly suggested. Neither is it about reopening history. It is about completing history. It does not target individual states, nor does it seek division. Rather, it establishes a principled framework for reconciliation grounded in truth. At its heart, this draft resolution is forward-looking and unifying. It is focused on truth, remembrance, education, and dialogue. It is grounded not in retribution, but in moral recognition. And it is intended to strengthen global efforts to combat racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia in all its forms. Excellencies, its objectives are clear: to provide formal and unequivocal recognition within the United Nations system of the world-breaking and world-redefining impact of the enslavement of Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans and people of African descent, to affirm their enduring consequences, not only for Africa and the people of African descent, but all of humanity, to reinforce ongoing global efforts toward reparatory justice through dialogue and cooperation, and to strengthen international solidarity in the fight against systemic racism and historical denialism. Distinguished delegates, the African Group expresses its sincere appreciation to all delegations for their constructive engagement throughout the negotiations. We believe that the present draft reflects the broadest possible views of member states on this important issue. Regrettably, legal technicalities and procedural arguments have been invoked to once again silence voices, to bury history, obscure clarity, and to prevent this noble institution from speaking plainly and firmly. But history does not disappear when ignored. Truth does not weaken when delayed. Crime does not rot, as we say in Africa. And justice does not expire with time. In affirming this declaration, we do more than honor memories. We strengthen the very foundations of justice upon which the United Nations was built. We affirm that human dignity is indivisible, that suffering must be acknowledged, and that reconciliation begins with truth courageously spoken. Your Excellencies, the founder of Ghana, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, proclaimed, quote, "Slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was a consequence of slavery. With this racial twist was invented the myth of color inferiority," unquote. Your Excellencies, the generation that founded this organization emerged from the ashes of global tragedy and pledged that humanity would never again look away from crimes that shock the conscience of humankind. Today, we are called to uphold that promise. The African Group, our co-sponsors, CARICOM, CELAC, our broad coalition of people with good conscience, including the NAACP, the Congressional Black Caucus, members of Parliament in the House of Commons, and other places, are sending a very clear message. They are calling upon all member states to stand on the right side of history and in our shared humanity to vote in favor of this resolution, and in doing so, reaffirm not only the past we remember, but the future we seek to build together. A future of social justice, a future of equality, and a future of mutual respect for human life. I thank you very much, Your Excellencies.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ghana. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/80/L.48. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Thank you, Mr. President. The present oral statement is made in the context of Rule 153 of the Rules of Procedure of the Assembly. The present statement has also been distributed to Member States. The request contained in Operative Paragraph 15 of the draft resolution would constitute an addition to the workload of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Department for the General Assembly and Conference Management in 2027, and entail additional resource requirements net of staff assessment in the amount of $117,700 in 2027. Detailed cost estimates and their underlying assumptions for the requirements are provided in the annex to this statement, which has been circulated. Accordingly, should the General Assembly adopt the draft resolution, L48, additional resource requirements estimated in the amount of $117,700 net of staff assessment would be included in the proposed program budget for 2027 under Section 2, General Assembly and Economic and Social Council Affairs and Conference Management, and Section 24, Human Rights for the consideration of the General Assembly at its 81st session. In addition, an amount of $12,800 would be included under Section 36, staff assessment, to be offset by an equivalent amount under Income Section 1, income from staff assessment. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the EU document, the foreign countries have also become co-sponsors of A/80/L48. Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Bangladesh, Belize, Brazil, Colombia, Haiti, Maldives, Pakistan, St. Lucia, Tajikistan, Timor-Leste, and the State of Palestine. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor L48, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see Kyrgyzstan, the Philippines, Cameroon, although Cameroon is already on the L document. That concludes additional co-sponsorship. Thank you, Mr. President.
Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States remains steadfast in its opposition and condemnation of historic wrongs that resulted from the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and all other forms of slavery. We remain committed to the acknowledgement that these historical wrongs. Despite this, the United States observes that the text of this resolution remains highly problematic in countless respects. Consequently, the United States cannot support the adoption of this resolution. We regret that the United States must once again remind this body that the United Nations exists to maintain international peace and security. It was not founded to advance narrow, specific interests and agendas, to establish niche international days, or to create new costly meeting and reporting mandates. This resolution does all three. The United States has defined long-standing objectives to the framing of reparatory justice and the duty of reparation for historical wrongs. While we acknowledge the horrors of the past, we do not accept this resolution's assertion that historical facts from the 15th through 19th century constitute violations of jus cogens, as the term is understood in contemporary international law. The United States also does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. In addition to its obvious legal problems, this resolution is also unclear as to who the recipients of reparatory justice would be. The drafters and supporters of this resolution seem to believe it is them. The United States strongly objects to the cynical usage of historical wrongs as a leverage point in an attempt to reallocate modern resources to people and nations who are distantly related to the historical victims. As stated at the outset of these negotiations, the United States also strongly objects to the resolution's attempt to rank crimes against humanity in any type of hierarchy. The assertion that some crimes against humanity are less severe than others objectively diminishes the suffering of countless victims and survivors of other atrocities throughout history. This is not a competition. This attempted ranking is also simply incorrect as a matter of law. The United States would also like to express disappointment in the arbitrary historical perspective of the text. Trafficking in African slaves began long before the 15th century and sadly continued even after the 19th. These dates were clearly selected for political reasons rather than historical accuracy. All trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans deserve to be condemned, not merely the political expedient. Also, there are some fake news articles suggesting that the sponsors of this resolution called into question President Trump's support of the Black community. We reject any such suggestions. Indeed, President Trump has done more for Black Americans than any other president and enjoyed historic support from the Black community in the 2024 election. He is working tirelessly to deliver for them and make our country greater than ever. Finally, we must express our deep disappointment regarding the process that led to this text. Throughout drafting, the United States and other delegations offered constructive contributions aimed at aligning the text with the established international legal frameworks. These contributions were ignored. For these reasons, the United States will vote no on this resolution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Cyprus on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as San Marino, align themselves with this statement. We welcome the African Union's initiative in advancing a dedicated resolution to one of the most heinous episodes in human history. The transatlantic slave trade remains an unparalleled tragedy, which lasted for over 3 centuries and involved unspeakable atrocities, affecting millions of Africans. It cannot and should not be forgotten. At the 7th Summit of the African Union and the European Union, last November in Angola, European and African leaders jointly recognized and profoundly regretted the untold suffering inflicted on millions of people as a result of the slave trade, colonialism, and apartheid. The EU is committed to shedding light on the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as their causes, consequences, and lasting impacts. It is our collective responsibility to learn from the wrongs of the past. We have to redress their enduring effects by removing barriers and tackling disparities that still hinder equal participation in society by the descendants of those affected. The EU is actively engaged across all relevant fora, including via the EU-AU Human Rights Dialogue process, to make progress on this issue. We acknowledge that further efforts are necessary, and we stand ready to continue working with partners in this direction. The recently adopted EU anti-racist strategy underscores the continued relevance of tackling the legacy of slavery, making this an important element on the fight against structural racism. This resolution was presented as a forward-looking and unifying process. It offered a meaningful opportunity to foster unity among UN member states to jointly address an issue of paramount importance for all. Regrettably, we were not able to reach a consensual outcome in the short time frame allocated to negotiations. We also regret that the proponents of the resolution did not reconsider their approach despite our repeated calls for more openness to constructive comments. Chair, we regret that our key concerns were not adequately reflected in the final text. We are concerned that this will send a wrong message on an issue where we do not fundamentally disagree. We were prepared to support a text that emphasizes the scale of the atrocity of the transatlantic slave trade, the importance of remembrance, and the need to continue combating slavery in its contemporary forms. Instead, the text before us raises a number of legal and factual concerns that we cannot overlook. First, the use of superlatives in the context of crimes against humanity is not legally accurate, such as the use of graves in the title and throughout the text, which implies a hierarchy among atrocity crimes, when no legal hierarchy between crimes against humanity exists. It risks undermining the harm suffered by all victims of these crimes and lacks legal clarity crucial for ensuring accountability. We firmly reject introducing ambiguity in this respect. Second, the selective inclusion of lengthy historical and contentious references to regional jurisprudence and selective and unbalanced interpretation of historical events, such as in preambular paragraphs 21 and 23, is at odds with accepted UN practice, as well as the stated universal and forward-looking objective of this initiative. It risks creating divisions when unity is both necessary and achievable. The role of the General Assembly is not to substitute itself to the academic debate amongst historians. Third, we are also concerned by certain legal references and assertions that are either inaccurate or inconsistent with international law. This includes suggestions of a retroactive application of international rules which were non-existent at the time, and claims for reparations, which is incompatible with established principles of international law. The principle of non-retroactivity, a fundamental cornerstone of the international legal order, must be strictly upheld. References to claims for reparations also lack a sound legal basis. Any framework for reparatory justice must be grounded in existing multilateral instruments. For these reasons, the Member States of the European Union regret that they are not in a position to support Resolution A/80/L48. Repeating our strongest condemnation of the slave trade and reaffirming our genuine commitment that we have demonstrated through concrete domestic and international action, we are compelled to abstain, solely out of profound respect for the subject matter and its complexities. This abstention should not be interpreted as leniency towards these apparent practices, nor in any case as acceptance of or acquiescence to the legal formulations in the text. We reserve our full position on these matters in all current and future relevant processes. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cyprus on behalf of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Señor presidente, Nicaragua agradece a Ghana y a África por la presentación de esta resolución con contenido de relevancia histórica, moral y política para los pueblos que hemos sido víctimas de la invasión, ocupación y conquista europea que impuso el colonialismo, la esclavitud, el saqueo de los recursos naturales, el despojo y el subsecuente sufrimiento de ese genocidio perpetrado contra nuestros pueblos originarios, destruyendo culturas que los invasores europeos, con sus limitados conocimientos, no poseían la capacidad de comprender dichas estructuras sociales, filosóficas y espirituales, llegando a la barbarie y el exterminio de pueblos enteros. Para los pueblos de nuestra América, esta memoria es parte inherente de nuestra determinación de ser libres y nunca esclavos. Nicaragua, en su lucha contra el colonialismo, abolió la esclavitud y sus atrocidades en 1821, y reconocemos que la trata transatlántica de hermanos y hermanas africanos y africanas y la esclavitud racializada constituyeron una de las manifestaciones más crueles de explotación y deshumanización de la historia, cuyas secuelas continúan presentes hasta nuestros días. En nuestro continente, la esclavitud, la violencia colonial, el despojo, la negación de la dignidad de los derechos de los pueblos y el desplazamiento también costaron la vida de millones y millones de seres humanos y dejaron consecuencias históricas profundas que todavía perduran y se reflejan en el empobrecimiento que siglos después aún persisten en nuestros países. En ese sentido, Nicaragua considera que esta resolución debe entenderse en un marco histórico más amplio, coherente con la posición sostenida por la Asamblea General sobre la urgencia de poner fin de una vez por todas al colonialismo y neocolonialismo y manifestaciones, así como de continuar afirmando el derecho de los pueblos a la autodeterminación y a la defensa de sus valores ancestrales. Señor presidente, Nicaragua votará a favor de la resolución por su aporte histórico, moral y político. Al mismo tiempo dejamos constancia de que Nicaragua no es Estado parte del Estatuto de Roma, ya que dicho instrumento no tiene carácter universal y por consiguiente tampoco somos parte de la Corte Penal Internacional y no reconocemos la jurisdicción de esa Corte. Por lo antes expuesto, nos desasociamos del párrafo preambular 27 de dicha resolución. Asimismo, reconocemos la importancia de que la Unión Africana, nuestra comunidad de Estados latinoamericanos y del Caribe, CELAC, y CARICOM, colaboren con Naciones Unidas en este tema. También nuestro reconocimiento y gratitud eterna a los y las luchadoras abolicionistas, al pueblo haitiano y su contribución histórica en esta lucha, siendo la primera república libre en nuestra América Latina y caribeña, logrando su independencia en el año 1804, aboliendo la esclavitud y ayudando al resto de nuestros países a alcanzar la independencia de los invasores europeos, especialmente en América del Sur. Décadas después, Frederick Douglass afirmó, y cito, que si no hay lucha, no hay progreso. Señor presidente, reafirmamos nuestra solidaridad con todas las víctimas de la esclavitud, el racismo y la discriminación y reiteramos nuestro compromiso con la verdad histórica, la dignidad de las víctimas y la necesidad de que la comunidad internacional continúe abordando estos crímenes, que haya justicia histórica, reparación y dignificación ante las consecuencias y los legados duraderos de la esclavitud, la trata y el colonialismo. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, la France souhaite expliquer le sens de son vote. L'abomination de l'esclavage a frappé pendant des siècles des dizaines de millions de femmes, d'hommes et d'enfants, bafouant les droits de l'homme et niant le principe même de dignité de la vie humaine. Face à la tragédie qu'ont constitué la traite transatlantique et l'esclavage, il nous faut regarder cette histoire en face, reconnaître sa vérité et, pour la France, assumer sa part de vérité, y compris en refusant l'oubli et l'effacement. C'est pourquoi la France se mobilise depuis plusieurs décennies pour la mémoire de l'esclavage, de ses victimes et de ceux qui l'ont combattu. Par une loi connue sous le nom de son auteur, Madame Christiane Taubira, adoptée il y a 25 ans, la France a été le premier pays au monde à reconnaître officiellement, avec force et sans aucune ambiguïté, que la traite et l'esclavage, je cite, perpétrés à partir du XVe siècle, aux Amériques, aux Caraïbes, dans l'océan Indien et en Europe, contre les populations africaines, amérindiennes, malgaches et indiennes, constituent un crime contre l'humanité. Fin de citation. Nous soutenons le travail des historiens et renforçons nos coopérations culturelles et éducatives en la matière. Nous avons créé en 2019 une fondation pour la mémoire de l'esclavage qui travaille à faire progresser la connaissance historique et à entretenir la mémoire des victimes et du combat pour les abolitions, contribuant à la lutte contre le racisme et les discriminations dans nos sociétés contemporaines. Nous inaugurerons bientôt un mémorial national des victimes de l'esclavage à Paris, à l'endroit même où la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme a été adoptée. Monsieur le Président, comme ses partenaires de l'Union européenne, la France s'abstiendra sur le texte, car nous estimons que la résolution proposée soulève sur le fond plusieurs difficultés au regard du droit international. Nous nous référons à cet égard à la déclaration qui vient d'être prononcée au nom de l'Union européenne et de ses États membres. Nous regrettons aussi que cette résolution semble établir une hiérarchie entre les crimes contre l'humanité. Outre qu'une telle approche soulève de sérieuses difficultés juridiques, elle risque aussi de mettre en concurrence des tragédies historiques qu'il n'y a pas lieu de comparer, sauf à le faire au détriment de la mémoire des victimes. Alors même que les Nations unies travaillent à l'élaboration d'une nouvelle convention internationale sur la prévention et la répression des crimes contre l'humanité, il nous semble important de rappeler que toute résolution de l'Assemblée générale doit s'ancrer dans le droit international et dans une approche universelle des droits de l'homme. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. We have had the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/80/L48 entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as a gravest crime against humanity. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of the draft resolution A/80/L48, please signify. Those against and those in abstention.
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/80/L48 entitled Declaration of the Trafficking of Enslaved Africans and Racialized Chattel Enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 123, against 3, abstentions 52. Therefore, draft resolution A/80/L48 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Chair, Excellencies. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, in explanation of our vote. CARICOM voted in support of this resolution because of our historical attachment to the issue of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans. The recognition today by those member states that supported this resolution and the declaration is a critical first step towards redressing the injustices perpetuated over the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. In this vein, CARICOM remains a strong advocate for the advancement of reparatory justice for the historical atrocities perpetuated against our forebears during the period of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the persistent legacies thereof. CARICOM therefore reiterates our support in principle for this initiative undertaken by Ghana on behalf of the African Union to advance the issue of reparatory justice. Given the importance of this issue, CARICOM stresses that implementation of the resolution must be done in a collaborative manner and in full partnership with the entire membership. CARICOM commits to contributing to taking forward the implementation of this resolution in line with the region's priorities, including the 10-point plan for reparatory justice. We will continue to engage meaningfully in future discussions on this important issue, including on ways to take forward the important provisions contained in the resolution. I thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Thank you, President. It is clear from the grim testimony that we have heard today that slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were appalling tragedies of an historic scale that constitute grave violations of human dignity and of the fundamental human rights of its victims. New Zealand recognises the profound and lasting impacts of the transatlantic slave trade and thanks Ghana for its efforts in bringing forward this resolution. We acknowledge the historical legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impact on many member states, and we welcome the importance placed on continuing education and awareness raising and the increased attention that commemorative events have brought to the issue. New Zealand supports proposals for meaningful, truthful and respectful dialogue among those most impacted, including reparatory justice and reconciliation through appropriate frameworks. We encourage the continued promotion of comprehensive educational programs, memorialization initiatives and research on slavery, the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans and their consequences. We had hoped to be able to vote in favour of this resolution, but regrettably, New Zealand was not in a position to endorse all aspects of the text presented today. New Zealand acknowledges the significance and horrific scale of transatlantic slavery, but it is not able to endorse a text that suggests a hierarchy of crimes against humanity and which has implications for other multilateral processes underway related to the progressive development of international law. New Zealand acknowledges the importance of restorative justice processes, including issues such as reparations, but believes these are more appropriately pursued through relevant judicial tribunals or agreed international legal forums. New Zealand was, unfortunately, not able to vote in favour of the text today, but we thank Ghana and the other co-sponsors once again for the resolution and reaffirm our support for meaningful dialogue, education and progress on addressing the impacts of the transatlantic slave trade. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Gracias, presidente. El Perú agradece a la distinguida delegación de Ghana por esta iniciativa que ha permitido retomar una reflexión seria y necesaria sobre la esclavización y la trata de personas africanas. Nuestro voto es coherente con los compromisos internacionales del Perú, encaminados a un combate firme para la erradicación del racismo y sus manifestaciones estructurales. El Perú ha votado a favor de este proyecto de resolución, convencido de que la trata transatlántica de africanos esclavizados y el sistema de esclavitud racializada constituyeron violaciones a los derechos humanos de una magnitud y duración tales que demandan el reconocimiento manifiesto de la comunidad internacional. Sus consecuencias todavía se sienten hoy en nuestras sociedades. Nuestro voto es también un acto de reconocimiento hacia la comunidad afroperuana. Aproximadamente 828.000 personas se autoidentifican como afroperuanas en nuestro territorio, lo que constituye alrededor de un 4% de la población total del Perú. Pero su legado político, económico, social y cultural trasciende ampliamente esta cifra y es parte constitutiva de nuestra identidad nacional. El Perú ha impulsado políticas concretas en esta materia, incluyendo la Política Nacional del Pueblo Afroperuano al 2030. No obstante, el Perú desea dejar constancia de cómo interpreta algunos alcances de la presente resolución. En primer lugar, el Perú entiende que la caracterización de la trata transatlántica como el crimen más grave contra la humanidad, contenida en los párrafos operativos 2 y 3, se entiende como una referencia a un acontecimiento particularmente grave en la historia de la humanidad, ocurrido en una etapa histórica específica. En segundo lugar, el Perú reconoce que, conforme al derecho internacional, la comisión de un hecho ilícito genera el deber de cesar dicho acto y, si éste continúa, así como de ofrecer seguridades y garantías adecuadas de no repetición cuando las circunstancias lo exigen. No obstante, el Perú toma nota de los párrafos operativos 6 a 8 y los interpreta como un llamado al diálogo voluntario, constructivo y de buena fe. Dichas disposiciones, en nuestra lectura, no prejuzgan ni establecen obligaciones por conductas anteriores al marco jurídico internacional vigente. En tercer lugar, el Perú subraya que la búsqueda de justicia frente a daños históricos debe ser accesible, inclusiva, universal y libre de toda forma de discriminación. En ese sentido, los principios afirmados en esta resolución deben servir de orientación para abordar otras posibles injusticias históricas y promover procesos que contribuyan al reconocimiento y la dignidad de las víctimas. Finalmente, el Perú hubiera preferido que una resolución sobre un tema tan trascendente fuese adoptada por consenso como resultado de un proceso de negociación más inclusivo y flexible. El Perú reitera su solidaridad con los pueblos de África, América y el Caribe y todas las personas de ascendencia africana. Reconoce particularmente las consecuencias de la esclavización sobre las vidas de las personas afrodescendientes en el Perú y en el mundo, marcadas por la discriminación racial y las desigualdades estructurales que se derivan de esta. Continuaremos participando constructivamente en el seguimiento de este diálogo e invocamos a que los siguientes pasos sobre este particular puedan ser abordados de manera consensuada. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein on behalf of Switzerland and Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver this joint explanation of vote on behalf of Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. At the outset, we underline the importance of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and commend efforts to ensure that the profound suffering caused by the trafficking of enslaved Africans is never forgotten nor diminished. To address the enduring consequences of slavery crimes, Liechtenstein launched the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative to combat modern forms of slavery and human trafficking. Against this background, the process leading to the adoption of this declaration is unfortunately a missed opportunity to broaden consensus and recognize the unprecedented nature of these crimes. We believe that more time and meaningful negotiations were needed to galvanize further support. Although we stressed our intention to support the spirit of this initiative, we, alongside others, raised concerns about inconsistencies of the declaration with international law. In particular, the qualification of the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity has no basis in international law and risk undermining the Rome Statute protecting civilian populations not only against enslavement, but also against other equally atrocious crimes against humanity. This is all the more regrettable as discussions on the inclusion of slavery crimes in the definition of crimes against humanity are taking place at the moment, both as part of the efforts to draft a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity, and also within the framework of the Rome Statute. These discussions are essential to guarantee that such atrocities are not repeated and that modern forms of slavery do not go unpunished. For these reasons, while we strongly support the underlying objective of recognition, we were unfortunately not in a position to vote in favor of the resolution as adopted. We remain committed to engaging constructively and support the remembrance of the trafficking, the transatlantic slave trade consistent with international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein on behalf of Switzerland and Iceland. I have the honor now to give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. The United Kingdom recognises the gravity of the issues addressed in this resolution and welcomes the opportunity to set out its position. We have repeatedly recognised the abhorrent nature of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, which inflicted untold harm and misery on millions of people over many decades. Its horrors were profound, and its legacy continues to leave deep scars today. The UK also believes that only by acknowledging and discussing collectively the most painful elements of the history that we share with other nations, including the transatlantic slave trade, can we come together in a spirit of solidarity and mutual respect to respond to the challenges that we all face today. The UK remains committed to that goal. That is why we engaged constructively throughout the negotiations on this resolution in the hope of reaching a consensual-based text. However, despite our efforts, our concerns have not been taken on board. The UK continues to disagree with fundamental propositions of the text and therefore, regrettably, could not vote in favour of it. Firstly, the UK is firmly of the view that we must not create a hierarchy of historical atrocities. Doing so simplifies the complexity and vast scale of suffering endured in different contexts. It risks diminishing the experiences of communities whose trauma and suffering was felt just as strongly. No single set of atrocities should be regarded as more or less significant than another. We should approach all historical injustices with the same seriousness, empathy, and respect to ensure that no one group is made to feel that their suffering is being overshadowed or treated as secondary. Furthermore, it's essential and integral to the rule of law that the formation and evolution of international law is governed by clear and well-defined principles. The principles of intertemporality and non-retroactivity are long-standing tenets of international law. They are essential to ensuring legal stability. According to the intertemporal rule, the applicable law is the law of the relevant time. International courts and tribunals have routinely upheld these principles. There is equally no duty to provide reparation for historical acts that were not, at the time those acts were committed, violations of international law. These principles cannot be circumvented by recourse to the concept of continuing harms. The UK welcomes that states have developed international law such that today's slavery and the slave trade are rightly prohibited by treaties and under customary international law, and enslavement is now recognised as a constituent element of a crime against humanity. Nonetheless, it's important to acknowledge with deep regret that the prohibitions on slavery, the slave trade, and what are now considered crimes against humanity had not yet been established in international law at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. None of the recognised sources of international law, as set out in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, identify a prohibition on slavery and the slave trade until the 20th century. The United Kingdom appreciates that Ghana, on behalf of the African Union, consistently stressed that this resolution was not to be read as a legal document. This was restated by the drafters at every informal consultation. In this context, the UK and others offered specific language to move the text away from legal to political discourse, while still reflecting the sheer gravity and horror of the acts. Member States also suggested the text should be considered by the Sixth Committee. Again, this was met with the response that this was a political declaration. The United Kingdom is keen to underscore this point on the AU's intention, while we continue to regret the failure to accept language that would have put the matter beyond doubt. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
The Kingdom of the Netherlands remains firmly committed to addressing racism and discrimination. We share the importance that the African group attaches to the lasting consequences of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. We fully recognize the profound injustice of this history and its continued impact today. In December 2022, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands offered formal apologies for the actions of the Dutch state towards enslaved people in the past, who suffered as a consequence of those actions everywhere in the world, as well as to all their descendants up to the present day. In July 2023, His Majesty King Willem-Alexander apologized for the Netherlands' slavery past. As a member of the European Union, we engage constructively in the negotiations on this resolution, and we greatly appreciate the efforts by Ghana and the African Union to bring forward this important initiative. In this vein, I would like to also say that we align ourselves with the statement delivered by the EU, and we sincerely regret that no consensus could be reached on a formulation that addresses key legal and substantive concerns. Having said that, the Kingdom of the Netherlands cannot support references that suggest the retroactive application of international law, including the implication of a legal obligation to provide reparations for acts that were not a violation of international law at the time they were committed. We also cannot agree to the introduction of a hierarchy among crimes against humanity, including the designation of one as the gravest, nor to references related to the non-applicability of statutory limitations. For these reasons, Mr. Chair, and despite the importance we attach to this very subject matter, my delegation has abstained on this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands. We have now had the last speaker in explanation of votes after the vote for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers in explanations of vote after the vote at a later date to be announced. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 119. Before adjourning the meeting, I will announce the results of the secret ballot. The Assembly will resume its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115 entitled Appointment of Members of the Board of the 10-Year Framework of Programs on Sustainable Consumption and Production Patterns. The results of the voting is as follows. Group A, African states, number of ballot papers, 180. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 180. Abstentions, 7. Number of members present and voting, 173. Required majority, 87. Number of votes obtained by each member state, South Africa, 173. Group B, Asia Pacific states, number of ballot papers, 180. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 180. Abstentions, 4. Number of members present and voting, 176. Required majority, 89. Number of votes obtained by each member state, India, 176. Group C, Eastern European states. Number of ballot papers, 180. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 180. Abstentions, 7. Number of members present and voting, 173. Required majority, 87. Number of votes obtained by each member state, Hungary, 158. Russian Federation, 126. Group D, Latin American and Caribbean states. Number of ballot papers, 180. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 180. Abstentions, 6. Number of members present and voting, 174. Required majority, 88. Number of votes obtained by each member state. Barbados, 173. Mexico, 168. Group E, Western European and other states. Number of ballot papers, 180. Number of invalid ballots, 0. Number of valid ballots, 180. Abstentions, 11. Number of members present and voting, 169. Required majority, 85. Number of votes obtained by each member state, Finland, 168. Germany, 166. The following states have thus been appointed as members of the board of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns for a term beginning on 25 March 2026 and ending on 24 March 2028. Barbados, Finland, Germany, Hungary, India, Mexico, the Russian Federation, and the Republic of South Africa. I thank the tellers for their assistance. Members are reminded that the following vacancies remain to be filled for a term beginning on the date of the appointment and expiring on 24 March 2028. 1 member from among the African states and 1 member from the Asia-Pacific states. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115. I thank the interpreters for the extension granted. The meeting is therefore adjourned.